بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى خصوصا على سيد الرسل وخاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله الأزكياء وأصحابه الأتقياء أما بعد. My background, I was born in Kentucky, small town Kentucky, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. My mother, Allah yarhamha, was a Hindu convert to Islam. My father was, for the most part of his life, a cab driver who worked very hard to provide for his family and to take care of his brothers and sisters with his dream that they would move to America. We were the house where the cousins came in when they arrived to America first. They spent a few weeks with us, a few months with us, and then went on to the next place, and then the next family came in, and the next family came in. In our small town, in our community, there was no religion. Most of the Muslims that lived there were there because it was small town, and for doctors in America, working in small town pays off very well. So there were a group of physicians that lived there. And then there were other families, my father wasn't one of the physicians, who were kind of a part of the community. If you guys have ever heard of Fort Knox, historically this is where a large sum, majority of America's gold was actually held. The physical bars of gold was held in Fort Knox, Kentucky. We would go there for Jum'ah Salah because we had no masjid in our community. I grew up praying Jum'ah on an American army base because there were soldiers from across the Muslim countries that would be there for training, so there would be a person there who could speak some Arabic and deliver the khutbah. My father had this dream that someone from his children would be connected to Islam, that they would know the deen. So with that dream, he sent my brother and myself to go and study. When my mother was alive, Allah yarhamha, one day she was at my home, and my oldest son, Muhammad, he was in the living room. My mother held him by the hand, and she said, "How old is your son today?" And I said, "He's 6 years old." She said, "This is how old you were when you left home to go and study the deen." She was holding my 6-year-old son. And that's true, because Kentucky, there was no place for us to study Islam. And I remember the pain till today of leaving my mother and traveling and wondering what life was going to be like. And it wasn't easy. There were moments while I was memorizing the Quran where I knew I was destined to fail. I was convinced of it. There were moments where I was memorizing the Quran and my teacher would say to me again and again, "Repeat your sabaq, repeat your lesson, repeat your lesson." There was loneliness, there was weakness. And sometimes I would think that being the son of a convert, probably this is the journey of my life where I'm not meant to do these things. When we would go to gatherings of knowledge and there were senior scholars sitting there, I was the one that would take the seat at the back because I didn't feel that I belonged in the front. I was speaking to one of my friends who graciously drove me today from London with his son. His young son is starting his memorization of the Quran. So in the morning when I woke up, he came to the room to wake me up. He sat on the bed next to me today morning. And I said to him, "Are you nervous about memorizing the Quran?" And he said, "Yeah, I am." I told him that you're going to cry a lot along the way because it's an interesting journey. And when you're in those moments of tears and when you're crying, whenever you feel vulnerable and weak, turn to Allah and ask Him for help. Emotions are fascinating. We human beings experience all sorts of emotions, but what you do with that emotion is actually the grand act. Your greatest moments will come after you are vulnerable, not at your strength, not at your peak. When a person is a little shooken up, when they're out of their element, when someone is broken, at that time they have this ability to reach a place in their heart that was inaccessible to them prior to that. So when you're reading the Quran and you feel overwhelmed, turn to Allah and ask Allah for that help. My teacher one day said to my mother that your son cannot memorize the Quran. He said this 3 years later, that this kid is not cut for this. My advice to you is put him in something else. And he was being very compassionate. May Allah reward him for that moment of honesty. My mother cried in front of my teacher. She tried to do it privately without me knowing. She turned her back towards me. They were standing on the staircase right outside the masjid. And she was crying and she said, Maulana Sahab, please try again. I really, really, really want this. So he said, okay, we'll try one more time. And through the du'as of my parents, somehow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala divinely opened up my mind and my heart, and I was able to memorize the Quran. Completing the Quran was powerful, because prior to completing the Quran, every time I saw someone reading their last sabaq, I would sit in the crowd with a deep sense of envy. I would ask myself if I was ever going to be there. If one day my mother would be proud and say that today my son led me in salah. If my father would be able to say that today my son led me through salah. When I finished memorizing the Quran, I was at a crossroads, because I had spent 3-4 years of my life, 4 or 5 years of my life memorizing the Quran, but I didn't know what role this had in my life. What was I supposed to do with this? I had memorized a text that if you were to test me, I could read it. I could read it properly. I could lead prayer. But what role did it have? I was confused and I didn't know. So one day I went to the teachers that were teaching in the masjid. We had this big masjid hall, and the teachers had their classes in different corners. And I went to greet the teachers, Assalamu alaikum, and that was the day that I had finished memorizing, so I also informed them that alhamdulillah, today I finished my memorization. One of the teachers, Hafiz Sulaiman, he shook my hand and he held it. And he said to me, Hussein, you will not benefit from the Quran until you understand it. And that was the moment, that was the turning moment in my life where I made intention to do the Alamiya program. Before that, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it. I know all the kids after Hifz, they went to study the Islamic higher studies, Islamic higher education program, a 6-7-year program. My parents weren't really pushing me on it, but that day I knew I wanted to do it. Where would I go? I found myself in England. How I ended up here is a whole different story. And it is a really fascinating one. I've been told I have limited time, so I can't even share that story with you. But if you guys want to hear the footnotes of that story, it's a really good one. My father told me this story. We had a motel, you know those bread and breakfast places? Off of a highway. Sheikh Abdullah Wahid has been there. He stayed at our motel before. One stormy night, on the highway, there was a person who was forced to take the exit, the exact exit that our hotel was on. My father had a policy that he never charged any Muslims to stay at our place because they never came. So they were a Muslim. Oh, there's Muslims here. Okay, you're coming over. My mother was Gujarati and she loved cooking food, so she just whipped up a whole meal. Every time any Muslims would come, they'd get free stay and free food. She would cook everyone every meal. One of those guys, oh my God, I'm going into the story. Okay, let me give you the footnotes. One of those guys at night blocked the toilet. So he calls my dad at 1 a.m. and says, Haji Saab, the toilet's blocked, I need help. My dad goes out there, fixes the toilet. He asks my dad, what are you guys doing here in nowhere, Kentucky? My dad says to him, this is a story. He hears about my mother, and he's like, tell me more about this lady. How did she accept Islam? So my dad tells her the whole story, phenomenal story again, purely divine. And after he hears this story, he says to my father, I am a Shaykh al-Hadith at a madrasa in the United Kingdom. If your son ever wants to do Alamiya program, make sure you send him to my school. So now when it came time for me to do Alamiya program, I said, Dad, where do I go? He said, there's this guy who came from Darul Uloom Bury. And he gave me his card and he said, you need to go there. And so I found myself on a flight in England, where I ended up spending the next 9 years of my life. Some of my most primitive, some of my most powerful moments are embedded in these streets. As I was driving today, I remember telling the brother that right here at this junction, I was driving Sheikh Yusuf rahimahullah, and he said this statement to me. Right here, this is exactly where I had an accident when I was driving. This Neeli Masjid, God, Rochdale, this is the place, we used to come here. And Oldham and all these places, they're so familiar. Cheetham Hill, right? I got robbed there. That's quite the cliche, isn't it? I was once sitting with one of my mentor and teacher, Sheikh Yusuf rahimahullah, and he was a man of silence. He didn't speak much. And for some people, the fact that he didn't engage with them was very bothersome. But he was a person of silence. He really kept quiet. He once said, every person must spiritually build themselves. Because life is very lonely. And he didn't say all of this. I'll tell you the part that he exactly said. Life is very lonely. Each and every one of you sitting here is on a journey, and every day you face new challenges. For someone, it's the journey of wearing hijab. For another person, it's the journey of being punctual with your prayer. For another person, it's figuring out how to make sense out of your own children. How do you make sense out of your family? How do you raise righteous children? How do you establish in your family the consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? These are very real things. And each person has their own version of this. I know for a fact, people sitting here who have family members that are gravely in trouble in life because they are very vulnerable. Maybe they're stuck with some mental health issues, or maybe there's someone here that has a relative that's in a nasty divorce, or someone has a horrible drug addiction. Life is very lonely. And you're trying to figure out what to say, what to do, and if people come to you, you can't even tell them what's going on because that is you being vulnerable. How can you expose yourself? How can you put yourself out there? So you bury it away in your heart and you continue to move on. But there must be an outlet. You must find strength. You have to anchor yourself to something. Something that you know is greater than you. Something that gives you internal and external strength to walk on this beautiful earth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Being in a society that is wrapped in non-stop ghafla, where we are just distracted at every moment of our life. Every interaction that we have on our phones, it takes our mind away. We're pulled away from what we are meant to do, what we are destined to do. Each human being here was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gave you a ruh through the process of taqween, a creation that is not preceded by anything. It is not brought up by anything. It's nothing, it's the ruh. So it does not take influence of anything. It is pure, and the ruh of the human being, the soul that lies at the center of your heart only knows one thing, and that is to love Allah. That's all it knows. And this is why when you sit in gatherings and people talk about remembering Allah or the dhikr of Allah, if you find yourself experiencing somewhat of a moment of stillness or potential excitement, that this is interesting, this is intriguing. This person's talking about loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm feeling a little different right now. That emotion that you experience in reality is your iman. It's your ruh buried deep away in layers and layers of ghafla, whispering from this cavern saying, let me out, this is why we were created. Focus on this right here. This is what matters. All the parties will disappear. All the shows will disappear. Within a blink of an eye, it'll all come to an end. One of my colleagues, Sheikh Abdul Nasir, his father passed away, Allah yarhamhu, this week. And we buried him 2 days ago. And when we lowered him into the grave, I whispered into his son's ear, your father is not going alone. Most people, when they leave this world, they leave alone. There's no one with them. as your eyes close and the angel of death extracts your soul, it all just disappears. All the arguments, all the frustrations. And this is what age does to you. Wisdom teaches you that all the hard feelings that you hold in your heart are not actually meaningful. We're all walking on a path of heading towards our end. And ultimately what it boils down to is when you leave the world, what do you have, what you don't have? And I'm whispering in this man's ear as I have my arm wrapped around him that, buddy, your dad's not going alone. He spent his life serving the deen, and he is leaving with a mountain of good deeds. We just sealed his grave. He is not alone in there. The Quran is there with him. Every day you, your brother, and your family members serve the deen, a new parcel of good deeds will be presented to your father. If the dead could turn their heads, they would turn their heads to see, who is this guy? What's this guy's deal? So in this chaotic world where we experience such deep vulnerability and loneliness, we fill those gaps and ignore the reality by remaining distracted. The spell has been casted on us. Few human beings have the ability to wake up. Iqbal referred to the ummah like the sleeping lion, just asleep. Because if this believer wakes up and they understand that my life is not haircut to haircut, it's not shopping spree to shopping spree, it's not dinner to dinner, it's not movie to movie, it's not weekend to weekend, check to check. God created every one of us. Allah Azza wa Jal created every one of us with a potential that we have not even scratched the surface to yet. So now Shaykh Yusuf rahimahullah describes. He says that strength in the heart is created through dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why the Quran repeatedly, not in one place, again and again, it invites us to be in a state of dhikr. Because as you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ghafla disappears. These are two opposites, heedlessness and remembrance of Allah. Every time you remember Allah. And if you're looking for a reason why you should remember Allah, if there was no virtue in the hadith at all, and if there was only this one part of an ayah that existed regarding the virtue of remembering Allah, it was sufficient. Allah Azza wa Jal says, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. There is no virtue greater than this right here. Remember me, I shall remember you. Remember me, I shall remember you. Stoned, intoxicated, covered in tears, torn apart, confused, unworthy. فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. Remember me, I shall remember you. So the Shaykh said that remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates strength in your heart. But remembering Allah creates a fort for you to exist in that is made of straw. If you actually want to be in a fort that is unbreakable, that'll happen through remembering Allah by engaging with the Quran. That's not weak, that's strong. Because the Quran is a very powerful reminder. When you read the Quran, you find lessons. Your past, your future, your present. Legal guidance. The Quran teaches us what to do, what not to do, morality. In a world where right and wrong is absolutely subjective. You know, someone was saying this to me earlier, that if you watch most of the movies today, what's the story? The story is that there is an evil person, and that evil person, the whole movie is about establishing how this person in reality, even though the world views them as evil, is not actually evil. They are a result of their circumstances. It's all about empathizing with evilness and removing the negative connotation of evil. In a world where people don't know what's right and wrong anymore, it's all about social media votes. Is Islam pro this or is it pro that? As Muslims, we have إِن تَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَكُمْ فُرْقَانًا. We have the Quran that is our criterion of right and wrong. Connect with that Quran. Read the stories of the prophets in the Quran, and every one of those stories will tell you one thing. There was a person that loved Allah. Allah tested them, and they remained loyal to Allah. Allah froze their loyalty in time for mankind to remember till as long as this world remains. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects those that are loyal to Him. Connect yourself to the Quran. Don't be afraid to pick it up. Don't be afraid to understand and try to sit with understanding what the Quran says. You owe it to yourself to at least read the Quran with its translation one time before you part this world. You owe it to yourself to understand what Fatiha is when you're reading it, because that is your path to Allah. As you're looking for ways to spiritually grow, know that the journey begins and it ends through ascending with the Quran. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from us all and allow us to build meaningful relationships. May Allah Azza wa Jal keep us in the company of the Quran, the people of the Quran. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow each and every one of us here to have those special, powerful moments, those private, intimate moments with the Quran. وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.